The January wind howled like a wounded beast as it swept through the yard of a private house on the outskirts of the village. In one corner, where the snow had drifted into deep mounds, stood a metal cage coated in frost. Its bars glistened like bones in the moonlight. Inside, curled into a tight ball, a dog trembled. A Central Asian shepherd, once a powerful creature, now a mere shadow of herself. Her matted, filthy coat could no longer shield her emaciated body from the cold, and each breath escaped her in short, misty bursts, dissolving into the icy air. Her name was Gera. She did not lift her head. Her eyes, dark as the winter night, stared into nothingness, not with defiance but with exhaustion. The yard was silent, save for the occasional creak of the gate as it banged in the wind. The house, with its crooked porch and dim window light, stood mute. The owner, a man with a heavy stare and hands that reeked of tobacco, had not stepped outside. 3 days earlier, he had placed the cage there, abandoning Gera on bare metal without food, water, or shelter. "Deserved it," was all he said when the neighbor, old Amelia, had dared to ask. Her voice had trembled, but he merely spat into the snow and slammed the door in her face. Amelia, a woman with a stooped back and hands roughened by life, could not forget Gera's gaze. She had known dogs all her life, kept mutts, fed strays, stitched up their wounds, but Gera was different. Her silence, her stillness, spoke not just of weakness, but of a pain too deep for words. It was her second sleepless night. She lay awake, listening to the wind, dreading that morning would bring the sight of the dog's lifeless body. She knew the owner wouldn't change his mind. His cruelty wasn't a burst of anger. It was as cold and deliberate as the frost. That morning, wrapped in an old shawl, Amelia called her niece, Sarah, a woman of iron will who worked with the local animal shelter. Sarah wasn't a volunteer in the usual sense. She didn't post online or raise funds. She took action. She found veterinarians, transported animals, fought for permits. Nadezhda spoke haltingly, describing the cage, Gera, and the owner's callous words. "She won't survive," she said, her voice breaking. "We have to do something." Sarah listened in silence, her fingers clenched around the phone. She knew men like him. People for whom a dog was nothing but a tool, and even imagined disobedience was punished without mercy. "I'll come," she said. "Wait for me." Nadezhda nodded, though her niece couldn't see it. She stepped outside. Her eyes fell on the cage, where Gera still lay, her breathing so faint it seemed the snow might cover her at any moment and take her away forever. Nadezhda clenched her fists. She couldn't change the world, but she could try to save this dog. And that was enough to begin. Snow crunched under Sarah's boots as she stepped out of her car, parked beside the leaning fence. The frost bit at her cheeks, but her gaze was as hard as the ice beneath her feet. In her hands she carried a warm blanket and a flashlight, its beam slicing through the darkness to reveal the contours of the yard. The cage stood in the corner, nearly buried in the snow. Inside lay Gera, her body almost indistinguishable from the frozen prison that held her. Sarah froze, her breath catching. The dog didn't move, but then, her eyes caught the beam of the light and shimmered like embers in ash. There was life in them, faint but defiant. Amelia waited by the gate, her shawl slipping to reveal strands of silvery hair that glowed faintly in the dim light. "She's doing very poorly," she whispered, her voice trembling, not just from the cold. Sarah nodded. Her face was stern, but a flicker of pain crossed her eyes. She had seen many dogs, beaten, starved, abandoned. Yet Gera was different. Her silence and stillness did not speak of fear, but of surrender, as if she had already accepted her fate. And that, Sarah thought, was far worse than a howl. It was despair. She approached the cage slowly, cautiously, careful not to startle the dog. Lowering herself to her knees, she paid no attention to the snow soaking through her jeans. "Gera," she called softly, her voice firm yet gentle. "I'm here." The dog didn't respond, but her ears gave a faint twitch, as if the sound of her name still meant something. Sarah noticed Gera's paws, tucked tightly against her body, crusted with ice. One hind leg lay at an unnatural angle, as though the dog was too afraid, or in too much pain, to move it. Sarah clenched her jaw. Time was slipping away. The door creaked open behind her, and the owner stepped onto the porch. His bulky, angular frame seemed to blend into the frozen yard. A cigarette glowed between his fingers, the only warm light in the scene. "What are you sticking your nose into?" he growled, his voice rasping like gravel. "She's mine. Deserved it." Amelia instinctively stepped back, her fingers twisting the edges of her shawl. But Sarah didn't move. She lifted her gaze, and her eyes were colder than the frost in the air. "For what?" she asked, her voice sharp as a blade. "For trusting you?" The man spat into the snow, his face twisted in anger. "She ate a chick, betrayed me. I fed her, and she..." Sarah didn't reply. She knew better than to argue. His words weren't an explanation, they were an excuse. She turned back to Gera, placing her hand on the blanket she'd brought. "We're taking her," she said without looking at him. It wasn't a request, it was a decision. Behind her, Amelia felt her heart contract. She remembered Gera, strong, proud, running across the yard, her bark echoing over the village. Back then, she had been loyal, vigilant, always searching her master's face for approval. But now her eyes were hollow, and Nadezhda knew it hadn't been a chicken or a fox. It was human cruelty that had broken her. She looked at Sarah, who was already unlatching the rusted cage door, and felt a flicker of hope. Maybe it wasn't too late. Sarah carefully opened the door. The rusted hinges creaked, slicing through the silence of the yard. The freezing air seemed to thicken, but she didn't feel it. Her attention was fixed solely on Gera. The dog's body, stiff with ice and pain, barely stirred. She didn't resist, but she didn't help either. Her legs, frozen and motionless, lay like foreign limbs. Sarah reached out, her work-worn fingers brushing against Gera's fur, cold and coarse as wire. "Come on, girl," she whispered, her voice quivering, not from fear, but from the desperate need to hold on to the fading spark of life. Amelia stood nearby, her breath forming clouds in the frosty air. She clutched the blanket Sarah had tossed to her and watched, eyes brimming with tears, as every movement unfolded in aching silence. Her niece wanted to help, but feared that her clumsiness might only make things worse. Max was large, even in her emaciated state, and lifting her from the cage was no easy task. Sarah gently slid her arms under the dog's body, doing her best to avoid the injured hind leg, which lay at an unnatural angle. Max let out a faint sound, not quite a whimper, not a growl, but something in between, as though pain and hope were caught together in her throat. The owner stood on the porch, watching. His cigarette had burned down to the filter, yet he remained motionless, his face lit dimly by the window behind him, frozen like a mask. "She'll die anyway, so what?" he muttered, just as Sarah finally pulled Max free and wrapped her in a blanket. Amelia flinched at his words, her lips tightening, but Sarah said nothing. She knew words would do nothing to change this. Her task was not to argue, but to save Max from the sentence that had already been passed. Sarah carried the dog to the car, moving slowly to avoid jostling her. Amelia followed close behind, her hands trembling as she held the flashlight, lighting the path through the snow. An old van, pre-warmed, waited near the gate. Sarah carefully laid Max on the back seat, where another blanket had been spread out, and checked her breathing, faint but steady. "Hold on," she said, her voice firm, almost a command. Max didn't respond. Her eyes were closed, but her chest continued to rise and fall. Amelia climbed into the front seat, nervously twisting the edge of her headscarf. "Where now, Sveta?" she asked, her voice tight with worry. Sarah started the engine, her jaw set. "To Olivia's," she replied. Olivia was an old acquaintance, a former nurse who now devoted her life to treating animals in her home. She had no veterinary license, but her hands knew how to coax life back into broken bodies. Sarah trusted her more than anyone else. The van pulled away, leaving behind the yard, the cage, and the silhouette of the man slowly vanishing into the storm. Amelia glanced at the side mirror, her heart clenched with helpless anger. She remembered how Max had once licked her hand through the fence, her eyes filled with trust. That trust had since been crushed, but Amelia clung to the belief that there was still hope. Gripping the steering wheel, Sarah was thinking the same thing. Max was still alive. And that alone was a beginning, fragile but real. Olivia's house stood at the edge of the village, its windows glowing with a soft, golden light that pierced the snowstorm. The old wooden fence, dusted with snow, creaked under the gusts of wind, but inside, it was warm. The air smelled of herbs and something deeply familiar, like time itself had paused in this place. Sarah carried Max inside, still wrapped in the blanket. Her arms trembled from strain, but she didn't falter. Amelia followed close behind, her face pale, her fingers clutching the edge of her scarf like a talisman. Max lay still, her breathing so faint that Sarah kept checking to see if she was still alive. Olivia, a short woman with cropped gray hair and hands marked by a lifetime of labor, was already waiting. Her eyes, sharp like a hawk's, softened when she saw Max. "Put her here," she said, pointing to a table covered in clean sheets. Her voice was calm, but carried the quiet authority of someone who would not be rushed. Sarah lowered Max gently, her fingers lingering on the dog's fur, as though afraid to let go. Olivia leaned over the animal, her hands moved quickly, but with great care. She checked the pulse, examined the legs, and frowned at the sight of frostbitten paw pads and the unmoving hind leg. "This is bad," she muttered. But even in her tone, there was no despair. Starvation, cold, trauma, but she's a fighter. By the doorway, Amelia felt her throat tighten. She wanted to ask whether Max would survive, but the words stuck in her mouth. Instead, she simply watched as Olivia prepared an IV, bottles of medication, and heating pads. Her movements were precise, almost surgical. Sarah helped, handing her instruments, her face focused and steady. She had seen Olivia work before, and she knew, if anyone could save Max, it was her. Olivia administered a warming solution to stabilize the dog and began carefully treating the frostbitten paws. Max didn't respond. Her eyes were half closed, unmoving, but her chest continued to rise and fall. That faint motion was the only thing keeping Amelia from breaking down. "She's strong," Sarah said quietly. Olivia nodded without looking up, still focused on her work. The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the rustle of movements and the wind howling outside the walls. Amelia remembered her own dog, a mutt named Ruzek, who had died in her arms many years ago. She'd been powerless then, and that helplessness still stung like an open wound. Now, watching Max, the same sorrow gripped her, but beside her were Olivia and Sarah. Women who did not give up. That gave her hope, a thin thread, but strong enough to hold on to. When Olivia finally finished, she straightened. Her face was tired, but her eyes burned with determination. "Now we wait," she said. "If she makes it through the night, she has a chance." Sarah nodded, her fingers tightening on the edge of the table. Amelia stepped closer, her eyes falling on Max. The dog's fur, still matted with dirt, seemed just a touch less cold now. She wanted to reach out and touch her, to offer comfort, but stopped herself, afraid to disturb the fragile calm that had settled over the animal. Instead, she whispered, "Hold on, girl." And in that moment, she believed that Max had heard her. The silence in Olivia's house was thick, like the snow blanketing the world outside. It was broken only by the soft crackling of firewood in the stove and Max's occasional shallow breaths. The dog lay on the table, wrapped in blankets. Her body trembled still, but now from warmth rather than cold. A thin IV line, delicate as spider silk, stretched to her paw, slowly feeding strength back into her frail frame. Sarah sat nearby, her eyes red from exhaustion, fixed unblinking on Max. Amelia had settled onto an old couch in the corner, fingers nervously twisting the edge of her headscarf, her thoughts circling endlessly around the dog whose life now hung by the thinnest of threads. Olivia moved between the table and the cabinet where she kept her medicines. Her steps were quiet, almost weightless, but her expression was tense. She checked Max's pulse, her fingers warm and steady, searching for signs of improvement. The temperature's rising, she murmured to herself. That's good. But her voice didn't quite mask the concern beneath. Frostbite, exhaustion, the injury to Max's hind leg. Each of these was a heavy burden for a creature whose will to live now flickered faintly. Olivia knew the coming night would be decisive. Sarah leaned closer, her hand resting lightly on the blanket without touching the dog. "Can you make it?" she whispered. Her voice was gentle, but carried an edge of steel. She remembered another stray she had found years ago on the side of a road, a dog that didn't survive. That loss still lived inside her. But Max was different. Even through half-lidded eyes, there was a spark, a flicker of life, that Sarah couldn't ignore. She would not let that spark die. Amelia, sitting silently in the corner, felt utterly helpless. Her life, marked by loss, a husband taken too soon, children scattered across distant places, had taught her to cherish the rare moments when something still could be changed. Max was such a moment. She looked at Olivia, at Sarah, at the motionless dog, and her heart ached with the injustice of it all. Why should Max, loyal, strong, have to suffer for human blindness? And yet, in this small room filled with warmth and care, she saw hope. Not loud or dramatic, but quiet, like the soft rhythm of Max's breath. Olivia returned to the table, her hands replacing a hot water bottle that had already cooled. "If she starts to respond," she said, looking to Sarah, "we can pull her through." Sarah nodded, her fingers tightening around the edge of the blanket. She didn't ask what would happen if Max didn't respond. That question hung in the air between them, but no one dared give it voice. Instead, they waited. Their eyes never left the dog, whose chest was now rising just a little more steadily than it had an hour before. The night dragged on slowly. Each minute stretched into eternity. Amelia eventually dozed off, her head resting on her shoulder. But Sarah and Olivia did not sleep. Just as the sky outside began to lighten, Max stirred. Her ears twitched, and her eyes opened slightly, catching the faint glow of the lamp. Sarah held her breath. Her heart began to race. Olivia stepped closer, and a faint smile flickered across her face. "There's my brave girl," she whispered. Max was still weak, but she was fighting, and that alone was enough to make the night feel like a beginning, not an end. The days at Olivia's house passed slowly, like snowmelt dripping from the eaves. Max now lay on a soft bedding Olivia had arranged in the corner of the room. Her body remained fragile, but no longer seemed on the verge of collapse. The IVs had been replaced with injections. Her frostbitten paws had begun to heal, though her hind leg remained motionless, a silent reminder of the cage she had escaped. Sarah came every day, her footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. She would sit beside Max without a word, simply being there, allowing the dog to grow used to her presence. Amelia visited as well, bringing homemade broth that Olivia would gently pour into Max's mouth. Max still did not eat on her own. Her eyes, though open, often gazed past them into a distance only she could see, but the hollow stare that had once terrified Sarah was gone. At times, Max's ears twitched at the sound of Olivia's voice or the creak of the door. It was a sign she was returning. When Olivia examined her legs, she noticed how Max would tense slightly at the touch, yet she didn't growl or pull away. "She's learning to trust," Olivia said one day, wiping her hands on her apron. But in her heart, she still felt the weight of that cage. Sarah nodded, her eyes fixed on Max. She remembered when her own life had felt like a cage, a marriage filled with silent reproaches, a job that drained her to the core. She had escaped, but the scars remained. Max reminded her of herself, strong but broken. And Sarah knew, trust never comes quickly. She would bring small pieces of meat and place them near Max without trying to coax her. Then, one morning, Max reached for a piece. Her nose twitched. She gave it a tentative lick. Sarah froze, then nearly laughed with joy. It wasn't just hunger. It was a step toward life. Amelia beamed when she saw it. "Look, Sveta," she said warmly. "She wants to live." Her voice was full of tenderness, as though she were speaking of her own child. She remembered how her granddaughter, as a toddler, had once clung to her hands, learning to walk. Max was like that. Every movement, every glance, was a triumph. Amelia would sit by her, fingers fidgeting with her handkerchief, telling Max about her garden and the flowers that would bloom in spring. She didn't know whether the dog understood, but she sensed that her voice mattered. Olivia watched them, her usually stern face softened. "She needs time," she said quietly, looking at Max. "And people who won't betray her." Sarah and Amelia exchanged a glance, their silence full of agreement. They knew Max wasn't just a dog. She was a mirror of their own losses, their battles, their hope. Each day spent with her was a promise that her story would not end in that frozen cage. By evening, when the sunlight painted the snow outside with golden hues, Max lifted her head for the first time. Her gaze met Sarah's, not with full trust, but with a flicker of something else. Not fear, not pain, something alive. Sarah smiled, her hand pausing above the bedding. "You're doing so well," she whispered. And in that moment, she believed Max would find her way to the light, even if the journey would be long. Spring crept shyly into the village, melting snow and revealing the damp earth beneath. In Olivia's home, the scent of dried herbs was gradually replaced by the fragrance of blooming lilacs growing near the fence. Max, now walking with a slight limp, was no longer. She no longer lay immobile for days on end upon her bedding. Her paws, still weak, carried her unsteadily around the room. Sarah's careful grooming had transformed Max's coat into a gleaming dark amber. Though cautious, her deep, attentive gaze followed every movement, no longer harboring that icy emptiness that had frightened them in the early days. Sarah came daily. Her presence became as natural to Max as the warmth of the stove. She never rushed the dog, nor demanded affection, but always brought small offerings, a piece of cheese, a toy braided from rope. At first, Max ignored these gifts, but one day, when Sarah placed an apple before her, the dog slowly reached out. Her nose touched the smooth skin, not to eat, but the gesture brimmed with curiosity. For Sarah, it was a triumph. Her heart tightened with a tender memory, and she smiled without taking her eyes off Max. Amelia's visits grew less frequent due to aching knees, yet she still brought broth in her stories. Seated on a chair, her soft, measured voice told Max of the past, of dogs that had once lived in her yard, and her granddaughter who promised to visit in summer. Max listened, her ears twitching slightly, and Nadezhda felt these conversations served as a bridge between them. She watched the dog's transformation with a warmth in her heart she had not felt for years. Olivia, observing Max, noticed how the dog began to respond to her voice. When called, Max lifted her head, her eyes seeking Olivia's with a glimmer of something new. Not fear or defiance, but a hint of trust. "She's learning," Olivia said one day, drying her hands on a towel. "But she needs someone who won't betray her." Sarah nodded, her thoughts consumed by Max's future. She knew Olivia's home was only a temporary refuge. The dog needed a place to truly belong, with her own space and people. One evening, as the sun set painting the sky in shades of rose, Sarah took Max into the yard. The dog moved slowly, her limp pronounced, but her steps were steady and sure. Sarah sat on the grass, her hand resting on the earth without reaching for Max. The dog paused, her gaze sweeping over Sarah's face. Then she stepped closer and lay down beside her. Her warm body touched Sarah's hand, not as a plea for affection, but as a deliberate choice. Sarah held her breath, her eyes shining. "You trust me," she whispered, her voice trembling. Amelia, watching from the window, felt tears sting her eyes. She recalled how, long ago, her late husband had brought home a puppy, saying, "He will teach us how to love." Max was that same lesson, not only for her but for everyone who cared. For Sarah and Olivia, they were all learning anew, to trust, to hope, to believe. And in that fragile moment, where woman and dog simply existed side by side, Amelia glimpsed a faint but unquenchable light. Summer arrived in the village quietly, scented with grass and warmed by a breeze that stirred dust along the dirt roads. Max, whose limp had now almost vanished, stood in Olivia's yard. Her coat caught the sunlight like dark gold. She no longer hid in corners. Her calm, deep gaze followed a butterfly fluttering among the flowers. Sarah sat on the porch, watching her. Her heart brimmed not with mere joy, but with something far greater, as if she had found a piece of peace long lost. That day, Amelia came carrying a basket of apples, her smile soft like summer light. Max's journey to a home had not been swift. Olivia and Sarah had searched long for someone who could understand her without demanding protection or heroics. That person was Henry, a former cynologist living in a neighboring village. His yard was simple, wooden fences and an old apple tree, but it radiated warmth. Henry wasn't looking for a working dog, he sought a companion. When he first saw Max, his eyes, weary from life, softened. "She's mine," he said simply. Olivia, usually stern, nodded in trust. The move was quiet. Sarah drove Max in the car, her hand resting close but not touching, ready to support if needed. Max watched the window, her ears twitching to the sound of the wind. Henry waited at the gate. His hands, large and weathered, were empty. No leash, no treats, only himself. Max stepped out slowly, yet confidently. She stopped before Henry, and their eyes met. In that instant, something clicked, like a key finding its lock. Amelia, standing a little apart, felt tears sting her eyes. She remembered Max lying in a cage, her breath barely there, the world an icy prison. Now, the dog who had endured betrayal and pain stood beneath the apple tree, her coat gleaming, her tail wagging gently for the first time in months. Amelia knew Max would never forget the cage, but she had learned to live beyond it, and that was a miracle woven from their shared faith. Henry demanded nothing of Max except that she be herself. She slept inside, on a soft bed by the stove, ate from a bowl he filled with care, and sometimes, in quiet evenings, rested her head on his lap. Her bark, once sharp and anxious, softened, as if she now guarded not a yard, but the warmth she had found. Sarah, visiting, saw how Max greeted her, not with fear, but with gentle curiosity, and that was her victory. That day, as they left Henry's home, Sarah and Amelia were silent, their hearts full. They knew Max was finally home, not just within walls, but in a world where she was loved not for what she could do, but simply for who she was. Amelia looked toward the road, where dust settled beneath the sun, and whispered, "You have made us better, girl." Sarah smiled, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Max had taught them all to love without fear, to trust without conditions, to hope even when the world feels frozen, and in that was her strength, delicate yet unbreakable.